The war began without warning. Ships appeared in the skies over Earth, dark and massive, like thunderclouds blotting out the sun. Cities burned before people could even understand who the attackers were. The alien fleets moved with terrifying precision, their weapons cutting through defenses as if Earth had no chance at all. For the first time in centuries, humanity faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Soldiers were sent to the front lines, but even the bravest found themselves outmatched by the invaders' sheer strength and numbers. The planet trembled under fire, and despair spread faster than hope. Among the chaos, one man marched through the battlefield. He had no special rank, no noble blood, no title worth remembering, but he carried something stronger than medals or power. His will refused to break. He had seen his home destroyed, his friends killed, yet his heart would not allow him to surrender. Through fire and ash, he kept moving forward, carrying wounded comrades when no one else dared. And it was during one of these desperate moments that his path crossed with something no human could have expected. She lay broken in the ruins, her armor shattered, her crown dented, her body bleeding from wounds that would have killed any normal being. She was not just another enemy soldier, she was their queen. The very figure whose orders had burned Earth cities now lay helpless, abandoned by her guards. Her eyes, glowing with alien fire, fixed on the human who stumbled upon her. For a moment, both stared in silence, each realizing the weight of the encounter. He could have ended her life right there. He had every reason to. But instead, he bent down and lifted her in his arms. Her body was heavy, far heavier than any human woman. Her skin burned like embers beneath his touch, yet he did not let go. The battlefield was filled with smoke, fire, and screams, but he carried her through it all, one step at a time. Each step was agony, his muscles tearing, his lungs burning, but he refused to stop. She could not understand him. In her mind, mercy was weakness. Her people ruled through fear and destruction. Yet here was a fragile creature, a human, choosing to carry his enemy queen across 40 miles of death and ruin. At first, she fought against his grip, her pride refusing to accept such humiliation. But her strength was fading, her body failing. His determination never faltered. He shielded her from falling debris, dragged her away from enemy fire, and pushed forward through lands scorched by her own army. She saw the pain in his eyes, but she also saw something else: resolve, compassion, and a kind of loyalty she had never known among her own kind. Slowly, the queen stopped resisting. Her hand clutched weakly at his chest, not in hatred, but in disbelief. The journey was endless. Night fell and rose again, and still he walked. His boots wore thin, his wounds deepened, and still he did not let her go. His mind screamed for rest, but his spirit roared louder. He whispered words she could not understand, but the tone was clear. He was promising her safety, even if it cost his life. For the first time, she wondered if everything she had believed about humans was wrong. She, who had ordered entire cities to burn, was now alive only because of the mercy of a single man. When they finally reached the edge of the battlefield, both were broken. The human collapsed to his knees, the queen still in his arms. Alien. Scouts saw them, shocked to find their sovereign carried by a mortal enemy. Their weapons rose, ready to strike the man down, but the queen raised her hand weakly. Her voice, though faint, carried the weight of command. She ordered them to stop. Not a single blade touched him. Instead, the soldiers fell silent, their eyes wide as they watched their queen, battered and humbled, protecting the human with the last of her strength. For the first time, her army hesitated. For the first time, her voice did not demand conquest, but commanded mercy. And though the human did not yet know it, his act had planted the seed of something far greater than victory or defeat. His decision to carry her instead of killing her would echo across both worlds, and history would remember the day the war began to change. The alien soldiers stood frozen, their weapons still raised but their fingers hesitant on the triggers. The Queen's command was something they could not question. She had never before spared an enemy, never before shown hesitation in the face of conquest, yet now she protected a single human with her life. The soldiers looked at one another in confusion, unsure if this was a test or betrayal. The human, exhausted and bleeding, barely understood what was happening. His vision blurred, his strength nearly gone, but still his arms refused to release her. The Queen felt the tremors of his failing body, yet she did not order him to drop her. She allowed him to hold her, something that shocked even herself. A transport ship was called. The alien soldiers, still wary, carried both Queen and human aboard. The Queen lay weak, her body barely clinging to life, while the human sat on the floor beside her, too stubborn to let go even when others tried to separate them. His arms were torn, his chest burned from enemy fire, but his grip was unyielding. He had carried her this far, and nothing would tear her from his protection now. The soldiers whispered among themselves, calling him foolish, fragile, reckless. Yet in their eyes there was also something else: curiosity, and perhaps even respect. The ship soared into the skies, leaving the smoking battlefield behind. The human felt no relief. He was surrounded by enemies, trapped among warriors who could end his life with a flick of their claws. But none dared strike. The Queen, though fading, kept her gaze on him. For the first time in her reign, she studied a creature she had always considered beneath her. His face was covered in ash, his body trembling from fatigue, yet his spirit burned brighter than the flames consuming the land below. She had seen soldiers stronger than him, fiercer than him, but none who carried such will. His existence was an insult to her pride, and yet a truth she could not ignore. When they reached the alien fortress, the human was thrown into a cell. They tried to pry the Queen away from him, but her voice thundered through the halls, commanding them to stop. Even in weakness, her authority was unshakable. Against every tradition of their people, against every law written in their conquest-driven empire, she declared that this human was under her protection. Soldiers bowed their heads, not daring to question her, but whispers spread like wildfire. The Queen who once demanded blood had now saved an enemy's life. The human sat in the cold cell, his body aching, yet his mind restless. He did not understand her words, but he understood her actions. She had stopped her army from killing him. She had defied her own people to keep him alive. It made no sense to him, just as his mercy had made no sense to her. He wondered if perhaps some bridge had been formed in the ashes of war, something fragile yet unbreakable. He leaned against the wall, his thoughts heavy, while outside the fortress, the alien council gathered in fury. They demanded answers. How could she, their queen, protect a human? How could she shame her people by sparing the life of their enemy? They accused her of weakness, of betrayal, but she silenced them with a single glare. She told them that mercy was not weakness, that this man had carried her when none of her own soldiers dared. She reminded them that not one of them had lifted her from the battlefield, but a human had walked 40 miles through fire and death to save her life. Her words shook the council, for never before had their queen admitted such a truth. The human remained imprisoned, unaware of the storm his actions had caused. Soldiers who once looked at him with hatred now approached with a different gaze. Some mocked him still, but others studied him with caution, realizing that their queen saw something in him worth protecting. Days passed. His wounds slowly healed, though his heart longed for freedom. Yet, in the silence of his cell, he felt no regret. He would have carried her again, even if it meant death. That thought gave him peace. And then one night the queen herself entered his cell. She moved slowly, her body still recovering, but her presence filled the room with power. The human rose to his feet, wary yet unafraid. She looked at him, her eyes piercing through the shadows. For the first time, she spoke words he could not understand, but her tone carried meaning. She touched his arm, the same arm that had carried her across the wasteland, and in that touch was gratitude. He could not speak her language, yet he nodded, and somehow, that was enough. The queen turned to the guards and issued a single order. The human was to be freed, and no hand was ever to harm him. The guards obeyed without question. From that night onward, the human was no longer a prisoner, but a guest within the halls of his enemy. And though he did not yet know it, his act of mercy had planted doubt in the hearts of an empire built on conquest. The war had not ended, but its course was already beginning to bend. The fortress was built from black stone and alien steel, a place that had never known the word mercy. Its walls had seen only war. Its halls echoed with commands of conquest. Yet now, deep within those walls, something impossible was unfolding. A human walked freely, guarded but untouched, under the queen's protection. The soldiers did not know whether to fear him, mock him, or respect him. To them, he was weak, yet he had done what none of them dared. Whispers spread quickly about the man who had carried their queen across fire and ruin, the man who defied death for an enemy. Some called him foolish, others whispered that perhaps he was chosen by fate. The queen, though still recovering, summoned him often. She asked him questions through translators, trying to understand what had driven him. Why had he not ended her life? Why had he not left her to die when he had every reason? His answers were simple, spoken with the honesty of a soldier who had lost too much. He told her that saving a life, even an enemy's, mattered more than revenge. He told her that he could not walk away from someone suffering, no matter who they were. His words were plain, but to the queen, they struck harder than any blade. She had ruled through fear, and yet here stood a human who fought not for power, but for something greater. Her council despised it. They demanded his execution. They warned her that the longer he lived, the more her people would doubt her strength. But she silenced them each time. She had seen his endurance, his mercy, his stubborn refusal to surrender. To her, this human was proof that the galaxy had underestimated Earth. Perhaps they had underestimated mercy itself. The council grew restless, and in secret, some began plotting. If the queen would not kill the human, then perhaps they would act without her command. Meanwhile, the human grew accustomed to the strange rhythms of the fortress. He ate alien food that burned his tongue, drank water that shimmered like liquid silver, and endured the stares of beings who had once hunted his kind. At night, he sat alone, thinking of Earth, of his people still suffering under fire. He wondered if carrying the queen had changed anything. Did his act of mercy matter beyond these walls? Did it save lives back home? He could not know. But what he did know was this: the war would not end if hatred ruled every heart. Someone had to break the cycle, and if it had to begin with him, then so be it. The queen began to change. Her voice softened when she spoke to him. Her gaze lingered, no longer filled with scorn, but with something she herself did not recognize. She watched him train, watched him mend his wounds without complaint, watched him stand tall even when surrounded by enemies. Her people obeyed her because of fear, but this human carried no crown, no throne, and yet others began to respect him too. It unsettled her, but it also awakened something she had buried long ago, a curiosity about what true strength really was. One evening, she summoned him to the throne chamber, a place where no human had ever stood. The council was present, their eyes burning with suspicion. The queen rose slowly, still not fully healed, and announced something that shook the entire hall. She declared that this human's life was sacred. No one would harm him. No army would move against him. She then said words that left even the council speechless. If the human's people could show the same mercy he had shown her, then perhaps this war did not need to continue. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Her words were not Just protection. They were the first spark of peace. But peace was dangerous. Her generals growled in defiance. They argued that mercy would lead to weakness, that sparing Earth would embolden other worlds to resist. They demanded proof that this human was worthy of such honor. So they proposed a trial. Not a fight to the death, but a test of endurance. A challenge that would prove whether the human strength was real or a lie. If he failed, they would strip away the Queen's command and kill him. If he succeeded, they would be forced to acknowledge him. The Queen hesitated. She did not want him to suffer further, but she knew her people would never follow her if she did not allow it. The human, hearing the challenge, did not falter. He agreed without question. He knew he had nothing but his will, but that was enough. The Queen's eyes met his, and though she said nothing, he could read what she felt. For the first time in her life, she was afraid, not of war, not of death, but of losing someone she had begun to trust. As the night ended, preparations for the trial began. The human stood alone, surrounded by enemies, yet he felt no fear. He had carried a queen across 40 miles of fire. Whatever test they gave him, he would endure. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but because he knew every step he took carried the hope of his people. The Queen watched him walk from the chamber, her heart heavy with something she had never felt before. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps, though she would never admit it, it was the beginning of respect that could change the fate of two worlds. Asterisk, the fortress courtyard filled with soldiers. The air was heavy with expectation, their eyes fixed on the lone human standing. In the center. Around him, alien banners waved in the wind, each marked with symbols of conquest and blood. Never before had an enemy been allowed to stand here. The challenge was ancient, older than most of the stars in their empire. It was not a duel of strength, but a test of endurance designed to break the body and spirit of anyone who attempted it. Few of their own warriors had survived it. None outside their kind had even been allowed to try. And yet, here stood a human, calm and unshaken. The trial began with silence. A soldier stepped forward and placed before the human a massive stone block, carved from metal-heavy rock. It was nearly impossible to lift, even for their strongest. The challenge was simple. Carry the weight across the courtyard, past obstacles designed to test every muscle, every breath. The alien crowd muttered, certain the human would collapse before taking 10 steps. But he did not hesitate. He crouched, gritted his teeth, and heaved the block onto his back. His knees trembled, his body screamed, but his spirit refused to give in. Step by step, he moved forward. The Queen watched from her throne above, her eyes burning as she followed his every move. Each time the block threatened to crush him, she clenched her fists. She had walked this path once in her youth as a test of her crown, but even she had nearly failed. To see a human, battered and scarred from war, endure the same trial shook her pride and her certainty. She had thought herself unbreakable. Yet this man, this mortal, proved that strength was not born from bloodlines but from will. The path grew worse. Soldiers hurled obstacles at his feet, shards of stone, pools of thick mud, sharp ridges of iron. The weight on his back pressed harder, cutting into his shoulders. His breath came ragged, blood dripping down his arms. The crowd jeered, mocking his weakness. Some demanded the trial end, certain he would die. But the human kept walking, each step a promise. He remembered carrying the Queen across the battlefield, her body heavier than any stone, his heart heavier than any crown. If he could walk through fire for her, he could carry this burden too. His legs buckled, but he rose again. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the courtyard. The block seemed fused to his back, every step tearing his body apart. And yet, the jeers began to fade. The crowd that mocked him now watched in silence. Soldiers who once spat curses now whispered to one another. The human should have collapsed. Long ago, by every measure, he should have failed. But still he endured. Each step was slower, each breath harsher, but his eyes never lost their fire. It was a fire they recognized, the same fire that once crowned their greatest warriors. At last he reached the final stretch. His vision blurred, his body broken, but he pressed on. The queen stood from her throne, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For a moment, the entire fortress held its breath. Then, with one last cry, the human staggered forward and dropped the stone beyond the final marker. The courtyard shook as the block hit the ground. Silence fell. The trial was complete. Against all odds, against all logic, a human had endured what even their kind feared. The soldiers lowered their heads. Some struck their chests in salute. The jeers were gone, replaced by respect carved in silence. For the first time, the human was no longer seen as prey, but as one of their own. The council, furious and speechless, could not deny what had been witnessed by thousands. By their own laws, the man had passed the trial. His life was no longer his alone. He had earned the right to walk their halls unchallenged. He had earned the right to be heard. The queen descended from her throne, her steps echoing against the stone floor. She stood before him, her towering form casting a shadow over his broken body. He was trembling, his knees barely holding him upright, yet he met her gaze without fear. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then she lowered her head, her voice strong enough for all to hear. She declared that this human strength was not weakness, but proof that Earth was not to be underestimated. She declared that mercy was not failure, but the highest form of power. And for the first time, her army roared in agreement. That night, fires burned across the fortress in celebration. Soldiers drank, shouted, and spoke of the human who had carried not only their queen, but also the weight of their trial. The queen, however, remained quiet. She knew the war was not yet over. The council still plotted, and her people were divided. But for the first time, she felt the tide shifting. She looked at the human resting in the hall, bandaged and weary. And she wondered if perhaps his act of mercy had done more than save her life. Perhaps it had saved them all. Asterisk, the celebration in the fortress carried into the night. Drums thundered. Warriors clashed their cups together, and firelight danced across the stone walls. The human sat quietly at the edge of it all, his body wrapped in fresh bandages, his arms still trembling from the trial. Yet even in his broken state, he had earned the respect of an empire. Soldiers approached him cautiously, some with salutes, others with quiet words of admiration. They still saw him as fragile, but they no longer saw him as prey. He had carried their queen across death, and he had carried their stone across fire. To them, that was no small thing, but not everyone celebrated. In hidden chambers deep within the fortress, the council gathered. Their faces were twisted with fury, their voices dripping with venom. They whispered that the queen had been corrupted, blinded by the mercy of a creature too weak to matter. They spoke of dishonor, of shame, of a path that would destroy their empire. If the queen continued down this road, they warned, their people would lose their fear. And without fear, they would lose their power. The decision was clear to them. The human must die, and if the queen stood in their way, then so must she. Plans were set in silence. Poison was prepared, blades were sharpened, and shadows moved through the fortress. But the queen was no fool. She had ruled for too long not to see treachery rising around her. She tightened her guard, placed loyal soldiers at her side, and watched the council with eyes as sharp as fire. Yet even she could not protect the human at every moment. He walked halls filled with enemies, some who respected him, others who dreamed of sinking a blade into his back. And though he sensed danger, he refused to hide. He had not hidden on the battlefield, and he would not hide now. One evening, as the fires dimmed and the fortress grew quiet, The human sat alone near the training yard. His breath was steady, his body still aching, but his mind restless. That was when he heard the sound of claws scraping against stone. He turned just as a shadow lunged. A dagger gleamed in the firelight, aimed for his heart. He raised his arm and caught the blow, pain exploding through his wrist. Another figure stepped from the dark, then another, until he was surrounded. The council had sent assassins, and they had no intention of letting him live to see the dawn. The human fought with everything he had. He was unarmed, his body still broken from the trial, but he moved with the same stubborn fire that had carried him across 40 miles of war. He blocked, dodged, and struck back with fists and elbows, each blow fueled by a refusal to surrender. Yet there were too many. Blades slashed his side, claws tore his shoulder, and his strength began to fade. He knew this might be his end. Still, he stood tall, daring them to cut him down. If he was to die, he would not die crawling. He would die as he had lived, defiant, unbroken. But before the assassins could land their final strike, a roar filled the yard. The queen descended like a storm, her voice thundering across the stone. Her soldiers poured in behind her, blades flashing in the firelight. The assassins hesitated, but the queen wasted no time. She struck with fury, her wounded body moving as though rage itself fueled her strength. One assassin fell, then another, until the survivors scattered into the shadows. The queen knelt beside the human, her hands pressing against his wounds. Her eyes burned, not with pride, but with something deeper fear. Fear that she had almost lost him. He tried to rise, but she pushed him down gently, her voice low but commanding. She told him he was a fool, reckless beyond reason. Yet even as she scolded him, her hands trembled against his skin. He did not understand her words, but he understood her tone. It was not the tone of a queen to her subject, nor of a conqueror to her captive. It was the voice of someone who had found value in another life, value she could not bear to lose. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and neither looked away. The council was dragged before her the next day. Their excuses filled the chamber like smoke, but the queen silenced them with a single command. She declared that their time of ruling through fear had ended. They had dishonored themselves, dishonored her, and dishonored their people. Some trembled, others spat curses, but all bowed when her voice struck them down. She made it clear. Human was not to be harmed. Any hand raised against him would be cut down, no matter who it belonged to. Her voice carried across the fortress, and the soldiers listened. The council had lost its grip. The human recovered slowly, his body scarred yet unbroken. Soldiers visited him, not out of duty, but out of respect. Some brought food, others brought stories of their people, as if trying to understand him as he had tried to understand them. The queen visited too, often in silence, watching him with eyes that revealed nothing and everything at once. She knew the path she had chosen was dangerous. She knew mercy would not be accepted easily. But as she looked at him, alive despite everything, she felt the first spark of certainty that her choice was the right one. The fortress no longer felt like a place of conquest. Whispers of change ran through its halls. Soldiers who once lived only for blood and victory now spoke of the human. They spoke of his trial, of his endurance, of the night he survived the blades of traitors. He had become more than a prisoner, more than a guest. He had become a symbol. The queen saw it too. Each day she watched him heal, watched him walk through the halls with quiet strength, watched him meet the eyes of her people without fear. He had no throne, no army, no crown, yet he carried respect heavier than any jewel of her empire. The council was broken, but not destroyed. Some members bent their heads to her will, others plotted still in silence, waiting for the chance to strike. The queen knew that peace could not survive if her command was not absolute. She could not let whispers of doubt undo what had begun. And so, she summoned her army, her generals, and her council into the grand hall. The human stood beside her, still scarred, but unyielding. The moment would decide not just his fate, but the fate of two worlds, the hall filled with firelight, and the stomp of boots. Banners hung heavy, the symbols of conquest casting shadows across the stone. The queen rose, her presence towering, her voice sharp as steel. She told her people that their empire had ruled by fear for too long. They had burned worlds, enslaved nations, and crushed all who resisted. But she declared that fear was not strength, it was emptiness. True strength, she said, was found in mercy. And to prove it, she lifted her arm and pointed to the human who stood silently at her side. She told them of the battlefield, of how none of her own soldiers had carried her broken body. She told them of the 40 miles walked by a man who owed her nothing, who had every reason to hate her, yet chose to save her life. She told them of the trial he endured, a trial meant to break warriors of their bloodline, yet survived by a man from a world they had called weak. Her words cut through the silence of the hall, each syllable striking at the pride of her empire. And then she spoke the words that would forever change history. She commanded her army to stop the war. She commanded them to spare Earth. She told them that if her people truly sought strength, then they must learn from the human who had carried her, from the mercy he had shown. There would be no more burning cities, no more slaughter of innocents. Any soldier who disobeyed would not defy Earth, but defy their queen. The hall erupted in gasps, some in fury, some in awe. Generals rose in protest, but her voice thundered above them, leaving no room for doubt. Her order was final. For a long moment, the hall hung in silence, broken only by the sound of the human's steady breath. Then, slowly, soldiers struck their chests in salute. Others followed, and then more, until the chamber shook with the roar of warriors acknowledging their queen's command. The council bowed, their defiance drowned beneath the weight of the army's voice. The war that had scorched Earth was over. Not with the fire of victory, but with the voice of a queen who had chosen mercy. And at the center of it all stood the human who had made it possible. The queen turned to him then, her eyes softer than any of her people had ever seen. She stepped close, her voice low so that only he could hear. She told him that he had changed her, that his act of mercy had shaken her more than any blade ever could. She admitted that she had once thought humans weak, but now she saw them as something far more dangerous not because of their weapons, but because of their hearts. He could not understand all her words, but he understood her meaning. And in that moment, both warrior and queen shared something no war could destroy. When the human finally returned to Earth, he returned not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a bridge between two worlds. His people saw the warships retreat, saw the skies clear, saw peace descend where fire once reigned. They asked what had changed, what had saved them, but he gave no grand speeches. He simply said that mercy had ended the war. Few believed him, but the truth did not matter. The galaxy itself had shifted, and it began with one man carrying his enemy across the fire. In the alien empire, songs were sung of the trial, of the night assassins failed, of the queen who changed because of a human's choice. Generals taught their warriors that strength was not only in blades, but in compassion. The queen ruled differently now, with the shadow of conquest replaced by the light of something far rarer. And though she never admitted it aloud, in her heart she knew her command had spared more than a planet. It had spared her own soul. The galaxy would remember the day mercy ended a war. And history would remember the nameless soldier who carried a queen for 40 miles, proving that even in the darkest fire, humanity's heart could change the fate of stars.